music has to sing its way through the film and remind the audience constantly that this is a mythology which has existed. John Milius had very strong ideas about the music for Conan the Barbarian. He knew that he had so little dialogue in the film that he wanted it to play as an opera does. When we were recording the first one, I remember there's a thing in music called the major third. It's what makes a chord either major or minor, happy, sad. I mean, it's that kind of association. It's just the difference between a half step, half tone in music. And every time I would strike this major third, Milius was standing in the booth and I was conducting, and he would do this gigantic cross, and he'd hit it and bang on the window. And I had no idea what the hell he was talking about, you know? I thought it was time out. I couldn't, so I went in and I said, so like, what's with the cross? He goes, it's too Christian. And so by understanding, you know, that to his ear, this interval, which is, you know, it's in everything we're used to. It's not an extraordinary interval at all. It's just very sophisticated in the development of musical history. And to his way of thinking, that there should be none of these things, at least in the main title. While we were in cinema school, I had written a piece of music that John quite never forgot. And he was convinced that it would be ideal if it were changed somewhat to represent the power, the strength, and the kind of energy that Conan the character should have. And I think that it was basically his remembering this thing that I had written when we were in college and performed on the piano. His using that as a starting point, that he wanted the rest of the score to have that kind of feel. And I think the thing that probably excited him about it was that it was very primitive. He knew that he wanted the music, like the film, to almost have a prehistoric quality to it. We had spoken about the way Miklos Rozsa created the musical soundscapes for Rome, for ancient Rome, in a lot of the films of the 50s. And we were both in agreement that that was way too modern for what Conan was supposed to be. So it was a combination of that. I think also the work that I had done for him on Big Wednesday. It was clear that he and I saw ultimately the same kind of vision of the film. I think if you look through a lot of various composers, and you'll see strong relationships with directors. And I'm certainly not conversant with any of them in terms of that. But you need to look no further than the association of John Williams and Steven Spielberg, and John Williams and George Lucas, Robert Zemeckis and Alan Silvestri, Danny Elfman and Tim Burton. I mean, I think that there are some very standout kinds of relationships that have worked really well throughout the last 15, 20 years. And I think that the directors involve these composers very heavily in their work. I'm not sure of that, but I would guess that's the way it works, particularly if there's pre-record material, if there's material that the composer needs to come up with while the film is in production, dance numbers, you know, this sort of thing. So there are various reasons to involve a composer, but I think probably the best reason would be because the director is interested in getting the composer in and becoming part of his or her vision as soon as possible. I studied to be a concert pianist, so my main performing instrument, I suppose, would be keyboards now. Originally it was piano, but now with the inclusion of synthesizers and most of the electronic controllers are keyboard-oriented, the work that we use for our computers. So that is my main instrument. the time constraints on writing a film have shrunk. Um, when I first started out, 12 weeks was not an unusual amount of time for a composer to be given to write a film score. And basically it broke down that the first 4 weeks were coming up with thematic material, working with the director, working with the music editors or the people that actually break down the timings of the films and the various scenes, and with the director and the composer map out how the score is going to go. And then the other 8 weeks were basically taken writing the score. These things have been cut down to anywhere between 4 and 6 weeks of actual writing and gestation, coming up with the themes themselves. So it's necessitated the inclusion of the orchestrator, and basically that's a person. Again, throughout Hollywood, they're used, variously in various different ways. I would write out sketches anywhere from 4 lines to 12 lines, depending on how complex the music needed to be in terms of the numbers of instruments performing it. The orchestrator then would take the sketch and literally, in a sketch, I might have one note that could represent 6 instruments, and then actually has to write a line of music for each individual instrument. So they take the sketch and blow it up to a full orchestration. And that relationship, I think, is key. It's absolutely key. As much as a composer is, must understand the vision of the director, the orchestrator must understand the vision of the composer. And it goes beyond, yes, you can become very specific and anybody could take a sketch. But I've always enjoyed working with orchestrators that I think know a little bit more about me. And if there's a chance for magic to get into the process, then I believe in that happening. A few years after I did Conan the Barbarian, then of course the sequel of Conan the Destroyer was on the boards and came out. Raffaella De Laurentiis, who produced the first Conan along with Buzz Feitshans, called and said that she would, was I interested in scoring Conan the Destroyer? Well, and I said, well, of course, because I figured, this is going to be a walk. I've already done all the music for the first one. The orchestrations were complete, so it's just a matter of, tearing the score pages out of the first one, throwing them into the second. We'll go to Rome and record, and that'll be it. That was a very naive and fallacious assumption, I have to tell you, because after meeting with Richard Fleischer and Raffaella, I realized they had a much different film on their hands. And I didn't see the film until after they had come back from shooting, and I think Frank Uriosti was the editor, if I'm not mistaken. And upon viewing the film, I realized that yes, there were certainly sections that cried for the use and the inclusion of some of the original material from Conan the Barbarian, but this was a whole different animal. This was an entirely different attitude. It was more. There was more of a lighthearted nature to it. It was more less concerned about revenge. In fact, there was very little revenge in it. So there were many main considerations that we had put into the first one that really were totally inappropriate for Conan the Destroyer. That's when the work began. So it just kind of grew from the original one. It was almost taking the original one and deconstructing it to making it fit. Because in a true sense, it really wasn't a sequel. It didn't pick up where Conan the Barbarian stopped. It kind of assumed that Conan had gone on and become a little more sophisticated, a little more worldly, learned language a little better, and the usage of it, and his ability to communicate with the outside world, instead of just looking for Thulsa Doom, wanting to, kill him. I don't think there's a composer alive who wouldn't embrace the opportunity to go back and change something. I really seriously doubt, if anybody would not welcome that chance. aside from the amount of work it would take and throwing yourself back into a reality that you might not have been too fond of at the time you were doing it. But nonetheless, sequels offer that opportunity. The main title of Conan itself, which then was later used in of course, Conan the Destroyer, came about from discussions with John. He wanted it to be rhythmic. He wanted it to be rhythmically insistent. He wanted it to have a power and this primitive thing without the Christian intervals, as he calls them. I also had orchestrated it for trombones and French horns. He thought the trombones were way too modern and had me take them out. And in fact, they were. I wrote that piece of music for the original funeral pyre when Conan gives her the Viking launch, is the way John refers to it, when he's cremating her. Of course, we needed to recall Valeria's theme. It's based on the Conan Valeria love theme, which is in the original one as well. So that was really, I think, one of the few references to Valeria in The Destroyer. But I sped it up. I do remember that. I made it faster because maybe memories go quicker than the actual occurrence of the event. The Hall of Mirrors is a real set piece, and I mean, both I think in the way it was designed for the film in terms of the production, the movement that goes through it, the fight that takes place within it, and the music itself. I mean, this is an example, I think, of the Conan being a little more sophisticated. It's completely interior. There's a modernity to it with the tricks of the mirrors, and it's the sort of thing that it just feels a little more sophisticated, a little more planned. It's a different kind of mind at work. So musically, I realized that I would have to represent that. There's more magic. There's kind of a sense of magic, a sense of discovery, a sense of deceit because of all the mirrors. And in the end, of course, is a sense of Conan's power because he ultimately wins over the adversity with which he's faced. Interestingly enough, that's one of the pieces I wrote first because I knew that needed to be a completely different type of sound, type of orchestration, with the exception of the theme that surfaces at the end. In the Hall of Mirrors, it needed a particular kind of sound. I think something that would reflect, no pun intended, the kind of shimmering, sparkling images that Richard used in the film. And for that reason, I chose instruments like piccolo and harpsichord and just things that musically would represent the kind of visual that goes along with it. It was, and again, it being interior has a whole different sound than if the thing had been shot out, say, in a plain or Stonehenge or something like that. So it had a whole, it was a place I knew I needed to work through this particular sequence of the movie because it was so different from the previous film. Some composers like to write the most difficult sequences first because they assume, or the longest ones, because they assume that it will be those sequences from which the material is mostly drawn from. It'll contain the most number of thematic ideas. I, on the other hand, usually skip the main title because I figure the main title is almost like an overture. unless there's some specific kinds of action going on that needs to be cued. Um, Main title usually comes, I'll write that last, generally. And then try to follow the arc of the film as best I can with the music. I'll know what the main themes are, the representations of the characters or the situations, or even sometimes, as in the case of Starship Troopers, the environments became major thematic motifs for me. I would prefer to do it linear. Oftentimes when we get into chasing a dub, which means basically the composer's still working while the film itself is being blended with the elements of the dialogue, sound effects, and music are being blended on in another stage, we're still writing. Or there might be changes. There are ubiquitous picture changes. So composers generally are working alongside the rest of the schedule. When they're dubbing, they generally prefer to dub in sequence. So therefore that requires that the music is recorded in sequence to keep feeding the dub stage the latest music that's coming out. And I think what we were going for was really more of a continuation of the first Conan, which was enhance what's on the screen, but also try to create a sense of a reality of it rather than an abstraction of it. It's a little more than see a monkey, hear a monkey, but hopefully it's more than that. But the main thing was to create this world and stay consistent within it.